The dust-covered streets of Copper Ridge stretched out under the blazing Arizona sun, like a canvas painted with the harsh realities of frontier life. Marshal Jake Sullivan had seen his share of trouble in this God-forsaken town, from cattle rustlers to claim jumpers, but nothing had prepared him for what he would witness on that sweltering Tuesday afternoon in August 1873. The general store stood at the heart of the settlement, its weathered wooden facade bearing the scars of countless sandstorms and the relentless passage of time. Inside, the familiar scent of leather, tobacco, and dried goods created an atmosphere that spoke of civilization's tenuous hold on this wild corner of the territory. Jake pushed through the batwing doors, his spurs jangling against the worn floorboards as he made his way toward the counter where old Henrik Larsen kept the town's mail sorted in wooden boxes. The marshal had come for his weekly correspondence, a routine that connected him to the world beyond the mesa and reminded him that law and order still mattered, even in places where the nearest courthouse was a 3-day ride away. As he approached the counter, his trained eye automatically scanned the store's interior, a habit born from years of keeping the peace in a land where danger could emerge from the most unexpected places. That's when he saw her, a slight figure no more than 8 years old, with golden hair braided down her back and wearing a faded blue dress that had seen better days. Little Emma Patterson stood near the pickle barrel, her small hands clutching a wooden doll that had been her constant companion since her family arrived in Copper Ridge 6 months earlier. But something about her posture struck Jake as wrong. The way she held herself rigid and kept glancing toward the store's entrance as if expecting someone unwelcome to appear at any moment. Her usually bright eyes, which normally sparkled with the innocent curiosity of childhood, now held a shadow that made the marshal's instincts prickle with concern. Emma's father, Thomas Patterson, had brought his family west after losing their farm in Kansas to a combination of drought and debt. They'd settled on a small homestead about 3 miles northeast of town, where Thomas worked sunrise to sunset, trying to coax crops from the stubborn desert soil, while his wife Mary took in sewing to help make ends meet. The Pattersons were good people, the kind of hard-working settlers that frontier communities desperately needed, and Jake had made it his business to check on isolated families like theirs whenever his duties permitted. But today, something in Emma's demeanor suggested that all was not well at the Patterson homestead. As Jake watched from the corner of his eye, while pretending to sort through his mail, he noticed Emma's peculiar behavior intensify. She kept moving her wooden doll in a specific pattern, lifting it up and down in what appeared to be a deliberate rhythm. At first, he dismissed it as the idle play of a bored child, but then he recognized something familiar in the sequence of movements. 3 short lifts, 3 long ones, 3 short again. It was Morse code, the same signal pattern that military telegraphers had used during the war, a distress call that every former soldier would recognize instantly. The realization hit Jake like a physical blow. Someone had taught this little girl to signal for help using a method that most adults in town wouldn't understand. The marshal's mind raced as he considered the implications. Emma was too young to have learned Morse code by accident, and her parents had never mentioned any military background that might explain her knowledge of such signals. Someone must have taught her this specific sequence recently, probably as a way for her to call for help without alerting potential threats to her intentions. The fact that she was using it now, in the middle of town's busiest store, suggested that she was in immediate danger and desperately seeking assistance from someone who might recognize her coded plea for help. Jake finished collecting his mail with deliberate slowness, all the while keeping Emma within his peripheral vision. The child continued her signaling for several more minutes, her small face growing increasingly anxious as other customers came and went without acknowledging her distress call. Finally, she seemed to realize that her message wasn't getting through, and Jake watched as her shoulders slumped in defeat. But just as she started to turn away from the pickle barrel, the marshal caught her eye and gave her the briefest of nods, followed by 3 quick taps of his finger against his gun belt. It was a simple acknowledgement signal that any telegrapher would understand, a way of telling her that her message had been received and understood. The relief that flooded across Emma's face was instantaneous and heartbreaking. Her eyes widened with a mixture of hope and desperation that no child should ever have to experience, and she mouthed the word, "please," so quietly that Jake had to read her lips to understand. Then, with a composure that impressed the marshal despite the circumstances, she gathered up her wooden doll and walked toward the store's exit with the measured steps of someone trying very hard not to appear rushed or frightened. Jake gave her a 10-minute head start before following, knowing that whoever had taught her the distress signal had probably also warned her about the importance of not being seen leaving with potential rescuers. The ride to the Patterson homestead took Jake through some of the most beautiful and desolate country in the territory. Red rock formations jutted up from the desert floor like ancient monuments to geological time, while sagebrush and prickly pear cactus dotted the landscape in patterns that seemed random but followed the hidden logic of water and shade. Under normal circumstances, Jake enjoyed this particular route for its scenic grandeur and the way it reminded him why he'd chosen to make his life in the American West. Today, however, the beauty of the landscape was overshadowed by his growing concern for the Patterson family and his speculation about what kind of trouble they might have encountered. As he crested the final rise before the Patterson homestead came into view, Jake reined in his horse and dismounted, pulling out a pair of field glasses that had served him well during his cavalry days. The small farmstead lay spread out in the valley below, consisting of a modest wooden house, a barn that looked like it had been built with more hope than skill, and a few outbuildings that housed chickens and stored what farming equipment Thomas had been able to afford. From his elevated position, Jake could see that something was definitely wrong with the normally peaceful scene below. 3 horses stood tied to the hitching post outside the Patterson house, their saddles and gear marking them as belonging to men who lived hard lives on the trail. Jake didn't recognize the animals, which meant the visitors weren't local ranchers or traveling merchants who might have legitimate business with the Patterson family. More troubling still was the fact that no smoke rose from the kitchen chimney, despite the fact that Mary Patterson was known for keeping a pot of coffee brewing throughout the day for anyone who might stop by their isolated homestead. The absence of such a basic sign of domestic activity suggested that the family's normal routine had been disrupted, probably by the uninvited guests whose horses now occupied their front yard. Jake studied the scene for several more minutes, noting the position of the windows, the layout of the outbuildings, and the natural approaches to the house that would provide the best cover for someone attempting to get close without being detected. His military training had taught him the importance of reconnaissance, and his years as a frontier lawman had reinforced the lesson that rushing into unknown situations was the fastest way to get innocent people killed. Whatever was happening inside that house, he would need to approach it with careful planning and more than a little bit of luck. The marshal secured his horse in a grove of cottonwood trees about half a mile from the homestead, then began working his way closer on foot, using the natural contours of the land and the sparse vegetation to conceal his approach. As he drew nearer to the house, he could hear voices drifting through the thin walls, though the words were too indistinct to make out clearly. What he could determine was that at least 3 different men were speaking, their tones alternating between cajoling persuasion and barely controlled menace. Occasionally, he heard Thomas Patterson's voice, strained and defensive, trying to reason with his unwelcome visitors. Mary's voice was notably absent from the conversation, which worried Jake more than he cared to admit. Moving around to the back of the house, Jake found a position beneath a kitchen window where he could finally make out the conversation taking place inside. What he heard made his blood run cold and his hand instinctively drift toward the grip of his Colt revolver. The three men inside weren't ordinary drifters or even common criminals looking for an easy score. They were members of the Garrison Gang, a group of Confederate deserters turned outlaws who had been terrorizing isolated homesteads throughout the territory for the better part of 2 years. Led by Captain Wade Garrison, a former cavalry officer who had gone rogue during the final months of the war, the gang was known for their particular brand of cruelty toward settlers they perceived as carpetbaggers or Union sympathizers. From his hiding place beneath the window, Jake could piece together the situation that had trapped the Patterson family in their own home. Garrison and his men had somehow learned that Thomas had served with an Illinois regiment during the war, information that marked him as an enemy in their twisted view of ongoing hostilities. They had come to the homestead initially intending to rob the family and move on, but when they discovered Thomas's military background, their plans had turned darker and more personal. Now they were demanding information about other Union veterans in the area, threatening Mary and Emma to force Thomas to provide names and locations of potential targets for future raids. The psychological torture that Jake witnessed through the window was as methodical as it was evil. Garrison, a tall man with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command, alternated between reasonable questions and casual threats, while his two companions made it clear through word and gesture that they were prepared to carry out whatever violence their leader deemed necessary. Mary Patterson sat in a kitchen chair with her hands bound behind her back, her face pale but determined, as she watched her husband struggle with an impossible choice. Thomas stood in the center of the room, his farmer's hands clenched into fists at his sides, torn between his desire to protect his neighbors and his desperate need to save his own family. But it was Emma's situation that truly broke Jake's heart and steeled his resolve for what would have to come next. The little girl sat on the floor in the corner of the room, her wooden doll clutched tightly against her chest, while one of Garrison's men, a lean, scarred individual who seemed to take particular pleasure in intimidating children, stood nearby making casual comments about what might happen to pretty little girls whose fathers refused to cooperate. Emma's earlier composure had finally cracked under the strain, and tears streaked down her cheeks as she tried to make herself as small as possible in her corner. The sight of her terror transformed Jake's professional concern into something much more personal and dangerous. Jake had faced overwhelming odds before, both during the war and in his years as a lawman, but 3 armed men holding hostages in an enclosed space presented tactical challenges that would test every skill he had acquired over the years. A direct assault would almost certainly result in casualties among the Patterson family, while attempting to negotiate with men like Garrison would likely prove futile and give them time to eliminate witnesses before escaping. What he needed was a way to separate the gang members from their hostages, or at least to create enough confusion to give the family a chance to escape while he dealt with their captors. The solution came to him as he studied the layout of the homestead and remembered his earlier observations about the absence of smoke from the kitchen chimney. The house had been built with a large central fireplace that served both heating and cooking functions, with a stone chimney that rose well above the roofline. If he could create a distraction that would draw at least some of the gang members outside, he might be able to improve the odds sufficiently to attempt a rescue. It would require precise timing and more than a little luck, but it was the best plan he could devise, given the circumstances and the limited time available. Moving carefully around the perimeter of the house, Jake gathered an armload of dry brush and kindling from the woodpile behind the kitchen. Then, working as quietly as possible, he climbed onto the roof, using a ladder that Thomas had left leaning against the back wall, probably after some recent repair work to the chimney or roof boards. Once on the roof, Jake stuffed the brush and kindling into the top of the chimney, knowing that when he lit it, the resulting smoke would quickly fill the interior of the house and force at least some of its occupants to come outside to investigate the problem. The plan worked better than Jake had dared to hope. Within minutes of lighting the brush in the chimney, smoke began billowing out of the fireplace and filling the main room of the house. He could hear shouting and confusion from below as the gang members tried to understand what was happening, followed by the sound of the front door being thrown open as someone rushed outside to check the roof for the source of the problem. Jake was waiting for them, positioned behind the chimney with his revolver drawn and ready. The first man out the door, the lean, scarred individual who had been threatening Emma, looked up just in time to see the marshal's gun pointed at his chest. The confrontation that followed was brief but violent, played out according to the brutal arithmetic of frontier justice. Jake's first shot took down the man on the porch before he could draw his own weapon, while his second shot, fired through the open doorway, caught one of the remaining gang members as he tried to position himself for a clear shot at the marshal. That left only Garrison himself, and Jake could hear the outlaw leader shouting threats and demands from inside the smoke-filled house, using the Patterson family as human shields while he tried to figure out how many lawmen he was facing and what his chances might be of fighting or negotiating his way out of the situation. But Garrison had made a critical error in his assessment of the situation, one that would ultimately cost him everything. Assuming that he was facing a posse, or at least multiple opponents, he had focused his attention on the front of the house, where the immediate threat seemed to be coming from. This left the back door unguarded for the crucial seconds that Jake needed to climb down from the roof and position himself for the final confrontation. The marshal's years of experience had taught him that in situations like this, speed and surprise were worth more than superior numbers, and he used both to his advantage as he prepared to end the standoff once and for all. Jake's entry through the back door caught Garrison completely off guard, and the final gunfight was decided in the space of a few heartbeats. The outlaw leader spun around with his pistol raised, but he was a fraction of a second too slow, and Jake's bullet found its mark before Garrison could complete his turn. The sound of the gunshot seemed to echo forever in the small room, followed by a silence that felt almost as loud as the violence that had preceded it. Then Emma's voice cut through the quiet, a single word that summarized everything Jake needed to know about the outcome of his desperate rescue attempt. The aftermath of the gunfight required careful attention to details that would matter greatly when Jake filed his official report with the territorial authorities. He untied Mary and Thomas Patterson, helped them tend to their daughter, and began the process of documenting what had happened at their homestead. The physical evidence told a clear story of self-defense and the protection of innocent civilians, but Jake knew that paperwork and legal proceedings were small comfort to a family that had endured such trauma. What mattered more was helping them process what they had experienced and begin the long journey back to feeling safe in their own home. As the sun began to set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded Jake why he loved this harsh but beautiful country, he helped the Patterson family make arrangements for dealing with the immediate aftermath of the attack. Thomas would need to ride into town to inform the undertaker about the bodies that would require burial, while Mary and Emma would stay with neighbors until they felt ready to return to their homestead. The psychological wounds would take longer to heal than any physical injuries, but the family had survived intact, and that was more than many frontier families could say after encountering men like Wade Garrison and his gang. Before leaving the homestead, Jake took a moment to speak privately with Emma about her quick thinking and the courage she had shown in signaling for help. He learned that her grandfather, Mary's father, had been a telegraph operator during the war, and had taught Emma the distress signal during a visit earlier in the summer. The old man had intended it as an interesting bit of family history, never imagining that his granddaughter would one day need to use the knowledge to save her family's lives. Emma's ability to remain calm under pressure and to recognize an opportunity to call for help had prevented what could have been a much greater tragedy. The story of Emma Patterson's rescue signal spread quickly through Copper Ridge and the surrounding territory, becoming one of those legends that frontier communities used to remind themselves that heroes could emerge from the most unlikely places and that hope could survive even in the darkest circumstances. The little girl's courage and quick thinking had saved her family from a terrible fate, while Marshal Jake Sullivan's response had eliminated a threat that might have claimed many more innocent lives. It was the kind of story that the American West produced with remarkable regularity, tales of ordinary people rising to extraordinary challenges and proving that civilization could take root even in the harshest environments. Years later, long after Emma had grown up and started a family of her own, she would still remember that terrible afternoon when she had stood in the general store desperately trying to signal for help. She would remember the relief she felt when Marshal Sullivan acknowledged her distress call, and the way that simple nod had given her the strength to endure what followed. Most of all, she would remember the lesson that her grandfather's wartime knowledge had taught her, that sometimes the smallest gestures can have the greatest consequences, and that courage comes in many forms, including the quiet determination of a frightened child who refuses to give up hope. The wooden doll that had been Emma's constant companion during those dark hours was eventually passed down to her own daughters and granddaughters, carrying with it the story of the day when a little girl's knowledge of Morse code and a marshal's quick thinking had triumphed over evil in a dusty frontier town. The doll became a family heirloom, a tangible reminder of the courage that runs in the bloodline and the importance of never underestimating what children can accomplish when they set their minds to it. And somewhere in that simple wooden toy and the story that surrounded it lived the enduring spirit of the American frontier, where ordinary people did extraordinary things and where help could come from the most unexpected places when it was needed most. If you enjoyed this tale of courage and quick thinking from the Old West, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to our channel for more stories of frontier heroism and adventure. We'd love to hear from you in the comments below, so please share your thoughts about Emma's bravery, or tell us about a time when you had to think quickly to help someone in need. What do you think was the most important lesson from this story, and how do you think you would have reacted in Marshal Sullivan's position? Your engagement helps us continue bringing these amazing stories from America's frontier past to life for new generations of listeners.